Ethical relativism and subjectivism. Ethical relativism is the view, not surprisingly, that ethics is not objective. It is also the view, in terms of what's typically known as cultural, moral, or ethical relativism, is the view that the validity, the correctness of moral claims depends on cultural acceptance. So when someone is a moral relativist, the idea is that they do accept that there is correct and incorrect in morality, but it's relative, typically to a particular culture. And I typically use the analogy of law to explain this. If, for example, one is in one country, whatever is legal in that country is legal, just by the laws of the country. And if one is another country with different laws, well, in the country where one is, those laws said what is legal. So depending on where you are, the very same thing could be, legal in one country and illegal in another. Now, for the ethical relativist, morality works the same way. So if you're in one culture, an action may be correct, in another culture it may be wrong. It all depends on where you are and when you are, if you're looking at the time factor. To borrow the old saying about when in Rome, in this case it's not when in Rome do as the Romans, it's when in Rome the Romans are right. Now, subjectivism is the view that the correctness of moral claims depends on the individual. So morality is relative to the individual. To use the analogy, it's much like one's taste in food. Essentially, if someone likes, say, bacon, then they like bacon. If someone doesn't, that person doesn't. There's no interpersonal moral values. What is good or evil depends on the individual. Now, in terms of relativism, some supporters or opponents include Herodotus, who's Greek and long dead, and also a much more recent philosopher named Gilbert Harman, who is well known, at least in philosophy, for endorsing ethical relativism. Now, Postman presents the following reconstruction for the argument for relativism. It involves the diversity thesis and the dependency thesis. Here's the idea. The diversity thesis is an anthropological or sociological hypothesis. It's a descriptive thesis, and it is as follows. What is considered morally right and wrong, it is claimed, varies from society to society. Therefore, there are no moral principles accepted by all societies. So this is the view, essentially, that morality is diverse, that it varies from society to society. The second step is what Postman calls the dependency thesis, which is the thesis that all moral principles derive their validity, their correctness, from cultural acceptance. This is a philosophical hypothesis, namely one of providing the foundation of morality. The conclusion, combining the diversity thesis and dependency thesis, would be that there are no universally valid moral principles. That is to say, there are no objective standards which apply to all people, everywhere, and all times. So relativism in this case would be true. So roughly put, again, reconstructing it, the idea is that, first step, morality varies from culture to culture. And secondly, what is right or wrong depends on the culture. Therefore, there are no objective moral principles, because it all varies from culture to culture. Now again, subjectivism takes it even more extremely. It's the view that the validity of moral principles depends on the individual accepting or rejecting those principles. Now, why do people like relativism? Well, one reason is this. People often find relativism in general to be appealing, the idea that truth depends on the culture. Second, the diversity thesis seems to clearly be a fact. Because if you travel, around the world, you'll note that ethical principles and theories vary considerably. Third, ethical relativism would seem to avoid the sin of what is known as ethnocentrism, which is an uncritical belief in the inherent superiority of one's own culture. And it also seems, on the face of it, to justify tolerance. In fact, an anthropologist, Melville Herskovits gives the following tolerance argument in favor of relativism. First, if morality is relative to the culture, then there is no independent basis for criticizing the morality of any other culture but one's own. Secondly, if there is no independent way of criticizing any other culture, we ought to be tolerant of the moralities of other cultures. It is claimed that morality is relative to the culture, therefore it is concluded that we ought to be tolerant of the moralities of other cultures. And that brings us to the end of the introduction of ethical relativism.